Sarah had just moved into the old apartment building on the corner of Wexler Street. It wasn't the prettiest place, but the price was right, and she needed a fresh start. The building had seen better days. The hallways smelled faintly of mildew, the wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the elevator creaked ominously. On her first day, she noticed how quiet it was. No sounds of televisions, music, or conversations leaked from the other units. Even the usual hum of city life outside seemed muted. Sarah had always found her new apartment building peculiar. It wasn't the creaky elevator or the faint smell of mildew lingering in the halls. It was the silence. The kind that seemed unnatural, almost oppressive. Of all the neighbors, only one caught her attention. The woman in 2B. She passed her neighbor's door, 2B, and noticed it was slightly ajar. For a moment she hesitated, expecting someone to step out, but the shadowed room remained still. Shrugging it off, she carried on with unpacking. Later that evening, Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway. She peeked out and saw her neighbor for the first time, a slender woman with pale skin and dark hair. She wore a long scarf draped loosely around her neck and carried herself as though the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. "Hi," Sarah said with a friendly smile. The woman stopped, hesitated, then nodded slightly. Her eyes were shadowed, as if she hadn't slept in days. "You're in 2B?" Sarah asked. "Yes," the woman replied softly, her voice almost too faint to hear. "You just moved in?" Sarah nodded. "I'm Sarah. Nice to meet you." The woman glanced down the hall nervously. "I'm Evelyn. Be careful here." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Evelyn slipped into her apartment, closing the door quietly behind her. In the following days, Sarah would occasionally see Evelyn. Each time, Evelyn's demeanor was the same, quiet, reserved, and almost fearful. One evening, as Sarah returned from work, Evelyn was standing in the hallway, staring at her own door. "Evelyn?" Sarah asked, approaching cautiously. "She's here," Evelyn whispered, not turning around. "Who's here?" "The woman who watches, the one who followed me home." Evelyn's voice cracked, and Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Do you need help?" Sarah offered. Evelyn finally turned to face her, tears in her eyes. "You wouldn't understand. Just don't linger in the halls after dark." Evelyn's warnings unsettled Sarah, but she tried to brush them off. Still, she couldn't shake the unease that settled over her. One night, she decided to dig into the building's history. What she found was disturbing. A series of unexplained incidents had occurred in the building over the years. Residents disappearing, reports of strange noises, and one unsolved murder. Evelyn Walker, the tenant of 2B, found strangled in her apartment 10 years ago. Her photo in the article was unmistakable. It was the same woman Sarah had been speaking to. The next day, Sarah knocked on Evelyn's door. After a long pause, it creaked open. Evelyn stood there, her scarf tightly wound around her neck. "I know," Sarah blurted out. "I read about what happened to you." Evelyn's expression softened. "You're the first to believe me." She stepped aside, motioning for Sarah to enter. The apartment was cold, far colder than it should have been. Sarah noticed the rocking chair in the corner, gently moving despite the still air. "Why are you still here?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I can't leave," Evelyn said. "Not until someone knows the truth." She began to tell her story. How she had been followed home one night. How she had sensed someone watching her for weeks before the attack. How, on the night of her murder, she had heard footsteps in the hallway. But when she opened the door, no one was there. "I screamed," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. But no one came. The next morning, Sarah went straight to the landlord's office. "There's something wrong with this building," she said. "Evelyn." The landlord held up a hand. "Evelyn? The woman from 2B?" He frowned. "That apartment's been vacant for years. After what happened, no one would take it." Sarah's blood ran cold. "But I've been talking to her. She's there." The landlord leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I don't know what to tell you, miss. That apartment's been locked up since the police finished their investigation. No one's lived there since." Determined to prove she wasn't imagining things, Sarah returned to 2B. She pushed the door open and found the apartment exactly as she'd seen it before, cold and sparse. "Evelyn?" she called. The rocking chair creaked. Slowly, Evelyn appeared from the shadows, her scarf trailing behind her like a ghostly ribbon. "I just wanted someone to listen," she said, her voice softer than ever. "You've done that for me." Before Sarah could respond, Evelyn began to fade, her form dissolving like mist in the pale moonlight. That night, Sarah woke to a strange feeling of peace. She glanced at her window and saw Evelyn one last time, her silhouette bathed in moonlight. But when she blinked, Evelyn was gone. In the morning, Sarah found a single note slipped under her door. It read, "You freed me." From that day on, the building felt different, warmer, lighter. But Sarah never forgot the chilling tale of the vanishing neighbor. The building felt different after that, warmer, brighter. Sarah stayed for a while but eventually moved on, unable to shake the memory of the vanishing neighbor and the chilling truth she'd uncovered. Before she moved out, Sarah decided to visit 2B one last time. The door was unlocked, the landlord having failed to re-secure it after their visit. Inside, the room was colder than she remembered, the rocking chair in its usual corner. But now, something was different. On the floor beneath the chair lay Evelyn's scarf, neatly folded. Sarah knelt down, hesitant, and picked it up. The fabric was soft, but cold, and as she held it, she heard the faintest whisper. "Thank you for listening." The chair creaked behind her, though no one sat in it. Sarah didn't look back. She placed the scarf on the chair and left the apartment for good, closing the door softly behind her. Even now, she sometimes hears the faint creak of a rocking chair and wonders if Evelyn truly found peace, or if she's still out there, waiting to be heard. Sarah moved out a week later, but she could never fully escape what had happened. Sometimes she dreamed of Evelyn, standing in the hallway, her scarf trailing behind her. Years passed, and the building fell into further disrepair. It was eventually condemned and torn down. On the day of its demolition, Sarah stood across the street, watching the walls crumble into dust. For a moment, as the wrecking ball struck, she thought she saw a figure in one of the windows, a woman with a scarf, smiling faintly before disappearing into the rubble. Though Evelyn was gone, her story remained with Sarah. She became an advocate for cold cases, dedicating her time to giving voices to the forgotten and the silenced. In her heart, she knew Evelyn had inspired her. Even so, when Sarah lay awake at night, the shadows in her room often felt too long, the air too cold. And sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she swore she could hear the faint creak of a rocking chair in the distance, as if Evelyn was still watching, grateful for the truth finally being heard.